Hello guys, my name is Anna and I'm your physiology lecturer. Today is our first lecture, and I'm gonna start my presentation with the introduction to physiology and homeostasis, and I'm gonna briefly discuss the whole and general things about the study of the body function, yeah? Let me start with the definition, what physiology actually is. Turns out that it comes from the Greek word physis, which means nature, and logos, which means study. And generally and basically, it's a study of how the body works, from the molecular mechanism to the actual tissues and organs and systems. And I want you to imagine that the whole organism and whole systems together work in order to maintain what's called homeostasis, which we're gonna discuss a bit later. Okay, so as you know, certain cells create certain tissues in our organism. Then the tissues create specific organs, and the organs, certain organs together are called organ systems. Here are our systems like cardiovascular, like digestive, like respiratory, urinary, skeletal, and muscular systems, which work together in order to maintain ourselves in a normal condition, maintain all the measurements in normal ranges, and so on. And let's see how this actually happens. But before that, let me just give you a brief example of what actually our organism does. It's a specific situation. For example, this girl is just holding a book in her hands, and or something, a notebook maybe, and reading something. And at the very same time, the eyes just get the visual information, send the information via signals, specific neuronal signals into the brain. Then the brain turns this visual information into the angular gyrus. For example, this is a specific part of the brain where the information is actually understood. So the person is able to understand what she or he is reading. And also brain is responsible for maintaining the posture, for actually controlling everything, every single detail in our body, and brain knows every single detail about our limbs, our movements, our thoughts. So together, brain controls almost everything. For example, in the lungs, this person probably this person's breathing is probably really calm and relaxed, so she may breathe in and out without even thinking about it, because the lung has its own function to maintain what's called tidal volume. And when we're gonna go through the respiratory system, we're gonna study what different volumes actually exist in the respiratory system. And the tidal volume represents our normal relaxed breathing process, like breathing in and out. As for the cells in the whole body, they consume oxygen and produce CO2 in exchange. Then the CO2 is of course traveled by the blood, via the blood to the lungs, and then it's expelled. As for the GI tract, it works independently, so that we don't even think about this process, and it has its own control mechanisms, of course, and so on and so on. Just to give you a brief overview how complex actually ongoing processes are in our body at a very specific and a very specific moment, for example, like reading a book or something like that, yeah? As for the homeostasis, let me give you the definition. This is a state of relative constancy of the internal environment, and it's maintained by different negative and positive loops in our body. And now I'm going to give you a brief example of what I actually mean in negative and positive loops. But before that, let me show you certain measurements in our body, which are very important to maintain in normal range. Why? Because if they deviate from the normal range, this can have a very negative effects on our health. For example, arterial pH has to be always 7.35 from 7.45, and if it goes if it's less than 7.35, then it leads to acidic environment. Then the blood becomes more acidic. If the pH goes really high, more than 7.45, then it's basic, and so on. I'm sure you know this whole general principle. As for the bicarbonate, sodium, calcium, and so on, other electrolytes, I'm sure you know that maintaining electrolytes in a normal range is a very important thing for the organism, and it's done by the kidneys, and a lot of different organ systems are involved in this process. For example, I'm going to tell you that if the potassium level becomes even high or low in both cases, this can lead to devastating arrhythmias, and arrhythmias are life-threatening. So even little change in potassium sometimes can be devastating. So I'm sure you understand how important it is to maintain the normal range of those little molecules. Okay, so how we actually maintain these things in the normal range? We have what's called negative feedback loops, and I'm going to give you nice examples to understand it better. For instance, blood glucose level. I'm sure you have learned in biochemistry section that when that's the blood glucose level is actually controlled by two huge hormones in your body, like insulin and the glucagon. And when the blood glucose level goes up after eating a meal, for example, insulin is released by the pancreas in order to turn blood glucose level into normal range. And how it's done by increasing the uptake of glucose by the cells, also increasing the storage of the glucose into glycogen in the liver, and so on. And as for the decreased level of the blood glucose decreased level of the blood glucose when it's when the person is fasting and the glucose level goes down, then the glucagon, another huge hormone, is released from the pancreas, and glucagon starts two processes: glycogenolysis, or in other words, breakdown process of the glycogen into glucose, and gluconeogenesis, or in other words, production of new glucose from different sources in order to increase glucose level. Yeah, so you see two nice examples of negative feedback loop. Next, negative feedback loop example is a controlled body temperature, and you know, maybe you have experienced when we are so very cold, body starts shivering on its own, and shivering helps us to increase our temperature. But when it's hot outside, or we are exercising, and or the environment is really hot, we start sweating, or we even start dilating of our superficial vessels, because dilation of the vessels help us to release heat into the environment and cool down and decrease our temperature. Yeah, this is another pretty nice example of negative feedback loops. And as for the quantitative measurement in experiment, let me just tell you that a lot of different experiments are held in physiology in order to understand the function of the body in a better way. So scientists always conduct different types of experiments for this specific aim. And let me show you the specific experiment where insulin was injected in a patient. And this pink line represents glucose level in the blood. And so when the insulin was injected, the glucose level immediately decreased, because, as I mentioned, insulin increases the uptake of glucose by the cells and increases the storage of glucose into the glycogen in the liver. So when the glucose decreases after insulin injection, after a certain period of time, and this line represents the time, yeah, body decides that this is a low range, that glucose is really low at this specific time in the blood, and that's why it has to be increased, and with a certain regulation mechanisms. For example, the negative feedback loop again, glucose again goes back to its normal level. So we experimentally decrease the glucose level by injecting insulin, but it has a tendency to go back to its normal range. And everything in our body generally has a tendency to go back to its normal range. I want you to understand this, and this is very specific to understanding physiology. Yeah? As for the positive feedback mechanisms, I don't want you to imagine that we have only negative feedback mechanisms. No, there are certain positive mechanisms, which means that one molecule or one process can amplify another processes in the body. And a nice example of this is coagulated cascade, where activation of, for example, one factor, like factor 12, can turn on the activation of factor 11, then the factor 9, then the factor 10, then on the extrinsic pathway, factor 7 helps this process. So one factor activates another, then another, and so last but not least, we get our fibrin produced, and this is a nice example of how positive feedback loop may work. Another example of it is the complement activation, and I'm going to tell you, if you have not studied it in immunology yet, that complement system and complement cascade is made up of certain proteins which are produced in the liver, and when the one protein is activated, it activates another protein, like a whole long chain. Then the other protein comes into play, then the other protein. Finally, there's three initiating ways of the complement cascade activation. And finally, we have one common way, and all of these ways lead to formation of membrane attack complex. Well, let me explain you that complement cascade is a part of the immune system which plays a part in defeating unknown pathogens like bacteria and so on. So membrane attack complex is the last product of complement cascade, which attacks the membrane of the bacteria, for example, and induces the death of the bacteria, the target, I mean. Another example is an LH surge. Let me show you on the graph in order to understand better. What is LH surge? During a menstrual cycle, I would say we have increased at a certain point, we have increased level of estrogen, and the increased level of estrogen is a signal for LH or luteinizing hormone to be increased as well, not decreased as it would be in a negative feedback loop, but increased because this is an example of positive feedback mechanism. Yeah, and so estrogen increase when the estrogen is high. This is a signal for LH surge, and LH surge, on the other hand, induces ovulation, which is the main part of the menstrual cycle, I would say. So without this, an anovulatory cycle would continue and happen, which gonna lead us to irregular menstrual cycle and a lot of different problems, infertility and so on. As for another hormone evolved in a positive feedback mechanism is oxytocin. Well, during labor, when the uterine is contracted vigorously in order to expel the baby out, this contraction is a signal for oxytocin to be released. But on the other hand, the oxytocin itself is a signal for the uterine to contract even more vigorously. So you have to imagine that this is a cycle, positive cycle. More contraction means more oxytocin means more contraction, and so on. Because it's really important in maintaining and conducting normal labor. Yeah. Now let me explain what actually controls our homeostasis. Turns out that two huge systems are mostly involved in this process, and these are the nervous system and endocrine system. And I'm pretty much happy to mention this because I'm a future endocrinologist, so I'm really in love with the hormones and these regulation mechanisms. First, before discussing endocrine system, I'm gonna discuss a bit about the nervous system. So in nervous system, you know that we have autonomic nervous system. There is a part of the whole nervous system which actually controls our body, all the systems, maybe mostly all the organ systems of our body, like lungs, like cardiovascular system, like GI tract, and so on. And the ANS, or in other words, autonomic nervous system, is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. A sympathetic system function can be referred as and explained with funny words, flight or fight reaction, or parasympathetic nervous system function can be explained with the words the arrest and digest. So they have antagonist functions, and they control certain things going in our body, which are not under our conscious control. And they maintain the homeostasis by working together. For example, when the pressure in our blood pressure in our body increases, this is sensed by the receptors located in aortic arch and carotid sinus. Yeah, and this impulse is sent to the brain by the cranial nerve 10 and cranial nerve 9. And the brain now knows that the blood pressure is too high. That means that the sympathetic nervous system has to be turned off, in order to decrease the pressure, in order to dilate the vessels, in order to decrease the heart rate and contractility of the heart, because it's controlled by the sympathetic nervous system and it's increased while it's active. And on the other hand, when the pressure is low and the baroreceptors are not really compressed by the excess pressure of the blood, this is another type of signal to the brain that the sympathetic nervous system has to be activated because pressure is low and pressure has to be increased. So what happens? Vasoconstriction and more contraction and vigorous contraction of the heart, and increased heart rate, and so on. Yeah, and there are a lot of other mechanisms how sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system work together in order to maintain homeostasis. And by the way, this specific example was an example of negative feedback loop. Yeah. And regulation by the hormones. So let me tell you that the hormones are actually tiny little molecules which are released directly into the blood, and they have their specific target organs and specific functions. And once again, let me explain once again with the example of the glucose regulation. So after fasting, after eating, the blood glucose level goes up. And this is an stimulus for the pancreas to release insulin, and then the glucose uptake by the cells increases, blood goes down. Yeah, for example, type 1 diabetes mellitus, which you're going to study during your pathology course, there is a deficiency of insulin itself, so the pancreas is not really able to produce insulin, because this is sometimes referred as an autonomic autoimmune disorder, where when our immune cells disrupt beta islets of the pancreas, so the insulin is not released from those cells. And when there is not enough insulin, of course, logically, blood glucose level goes up. Yeah, so these patients require externally getting insulin infusion, and it's very important for them to control their blood glucose level. Yeah. As for the fasting state, after fasting state, glucose level goes down, then glucagon is released, and with certain mechanisms, glucagon can increase blood glucose level. And by the way, here once again, I can mention type 2 diabetes. For example, I've mentioned the type 1, and I'm going to add some information about type 2 as well. When we have insulin in our body, but the cells which had to uptake glucose by the action of insulin. Yeah, cells are really resistant to insulin. They do not respond to insulin effect. So despite the fact that insulin level is normal in the body, cells are resistant. So glucose still goes up, and there are there are different types of medications which can control this specific pathologic situation in the body. Yeah. So I think that's enough for the first topic. Let me make a brief conclusion. Well, the physiology studies the function of the body. The internal environment of the body is closely regulated by different mechanisms, which include positive and negative feedback loops. Huge role in this process is played by the nervous and endocrine system, and a lot of different receptors, mediators, and hormones work together in order to maintain homeostasis. As for your homework, please see the last slide of the PPT, the presentation. Your book is Stuart Fox, Human Physiology, 15th edition, 2019 is the year, and you have chapter 1, exactly 1.1 and 1.2. Yeah. So in case of questions, you can reach me out, and I'm going to answer all of them as soon as possible. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening.